We're going to start tonight, though, with the Attorney General of the United States today making an unusual decision. Today, the Attorney General decided to throw a big can of gasoline onto the always smoldering fires of Trump world conspiracy theories about the Russia investigation and Robert Mueller.
News just broke today that you have a special team looking into why the FBI opened an investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 elections. Can you share with us why you feel a need to do that?
I think spying on a political campaign is a big deal. It's a big deal. Generation I grew up in, which was the Vietnam War period, people were all concerned about spying on anti-war people and so forth by the government. And there were a lot of rules put in place to make sure that there's an adequate basis before our law enforcement agencies get involved in political surveillance. I'm not suggesting that those rules were violated, but I think it's important to look at that. And I'm not talking about the FBI necessarily, but intelligence agencies more broadly.
So you're not suggesting, though, that spying occurred?
I don't, I guess you could, I think spying did occur. Yes, I think spying did occur.
Are you sure you want to say that? Do you know exactly what you mean to say here? Do you want to think about it? I mean, it may be that Attorney General William Barr is just, he's curious. He's a curious guy, wants to ask questions. He's recently appointed. He's only been there 7 weeks. You take a new job. You want to be thorough. Right? I'm not suggesting any rules were violated, but spying on a political campaign, that'd be a huge deal. Did spying happen? Well, I don't mean... did anything ever come of that whole year-plus long effort by the president to say that maybe the FBI investigation into Russian interference in the elections was just one big hoax? It was just made up? Whatever happened to that claim? Are we still trying to say that with, Obama tapping his wires and all that? Are we still saying that? Is that still the line that we're working? Just curious. Should we chase that down? I mean, when the Attorney General of the United States goes before Congress and says there was spying on the Trump campaign, that's not a dog whistle to the president and his allies about the thoroughly debunked conspiracy theories about Robert Mueller and spying and President Obama having wiretaps. I mean, that's not a dog whistle. That's an air horn. And whatever reason, Attorney General William Barr decided to blow that air horn today. It's interesting. It comes on the same day that we got fresh evidence of how and why the investigation into Russia and the Trump campaign really did begin in 2016, and specifically how alarmed the country's top national security officials were at the intelligence they were seeing and the evidence they were seeing, and how seriously they took their obligation to look into it. Because all this happened today with the Attorney General on the same day that we got a new transcript of another day of testimony that the FBI's general counsel gave to Congress behind closed doors last October. This is testimony that's never before seen the light of day. It was not unsealed, it was released today by Republican members of the committee. James Baker was the FBI's general counsel in the summer of 2016 when the counterintelligence investigation began into any potential links between the Trump campaign and Russia interfering in the election. Here's how James Baker describes the beginning of the investigation. Again, this transcript just released to the public for the first time today. Quote, "We were concerned that the Russians were engaged in an effort to try to impact our elections, that particular election, and we were trying to figure out exactly what they were doing and how they were doing it." Question, well, was the case a priority for the FBI? James Baker, yes. Question, did you think that was the right decision? Baker, yes. Question, why? Baker, because if the Russians were trying to influence something as fundamental as a presidential election, then I thought that would be a particular threat to the country, because so much of our system depends on the integrity of our elections. So much of our constitutional system depends on the integrity of our elections. Question, would that threat to the national security increase if the president was elected and therefore obtained classified briefings and was exposed to the nation's most sensitive secrets? If there was someone within, if he or someone within his campaign had been, in fact, working with the Russians? Answer from Jim Baker. Let me answer that generally. I guess I would say I think we were concerned about anyone who might enter government, and be in a position to have access to classified or sensitive information who might provide that to a foreign power. Question: how serious would that concern be? James Baker: extremely serious. You know, with remarkable consistency, every time we get one of these transcripts from a senior FBI official, senior Justice Department official, senior national security official who is at all involved in this investigation, they describe their work in 2016 in these very simple terms. They saw signs of the Russian government interfering to try to influence our election. And they saw all these unexplained contacts between Russians and the Trump campaign. And they were concerned about the implications of that. They were concerned that the country, and therefore the Trump campaign itself, they were concerned that the campaign should be protected from whatever was going on. I mean, weirdly, it is the Republicans in Congress who have been unilaterally releasing these transcripts over the past few weeks. I don't know what smoking gun they expect us to find here. I mean, nobody in these interviews has even hinted at the possibility that there was any politically motivated spying on the Trump campaign. But you know what? You know, maybe it wasn't the FBI. One of the odd things about the Attorney General's testimony today is that even as he said he believed spying on the Trump campaign did occur, he kept going out of his way to say he was not necessarily talking about the FBI doing that spying. He was talking about the intelligence community more broadly. Okay, what could he mean? I mean, if he's talking about the FBI and the Justice Department, honestly, the FBI and the Justice Department are on the record over and over again saying, no, they didn't do any spying on the Trump campaign, and nobody has yet found any evidence to call that into question. If Barr is talking about, you know, as Attorney General, he's going to investigate the intelligence community instead, that's a little weird. It's a little off, but okay, maybe that's what he's doing. That said, Mark Warner, who's the ranking member on the Senate Intelligence Committee, the committee that oversees the intelligence community, and he's been that for a long time, Mark Warner today, in response to these comments from the Attorney General, says, nope, he would know as the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. And it wasn't the intelligence community spying on the Trump campaign either. Didn't happen.
I'm flabbergasted by the Attorney General's comments. I don't get it. Is the Attorney General questioning whether Russia intervened? Is he questioning whether Russia intervened in the campaign on behalf of Trump and against Clinton, things that the intelligence community has unanimously agreed upon? Is he somehow saying that the FBI and the Department of Justice shouldn't have started a counterintelligence investigation? Remember back in the summer and fall of 2016, the intelligence community brought this information to the full Gang of Eight in an effort to try to warn the American public about Russia was doing this. He's saying the intelligence community should have sat on that information. I think the Attorney General's comments today do a great disservice to the men and women at the FBI and Department of Justice, who I think back in 2016 were just doing their job. But what I feel of this man with this much experience who's using these partisan talking points from some of the far right that have been, frankly, investigated and litigated half a dozen times already. I don't get it.
I mean, have you ever seen, I mean, you've delved into this subject particularly.
We have reviewed this extensively. The whole basis, the first part of our bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee investigation was looking at what the intelligence community did in terms of making their findings that Russia intervened, and they did it on behalf of one candidate, Donald Trump, against another one, Hillary Clinton. Nobody has questioned that.
We have reviewed this extensively. The intelligence community was not spying on the Trump campaign. They were investigating Russian interference. The FBI and DOJ were not spying on the Trump campaign. So what is Bill Barr talking about when he says, yeah, I think there was spying on the Trump campaign? I mean, I'm assuming that he didn't just, you know, make that up. Like, I heard somebody talking about that on Fox and Friends, didn't I? Yeah, didn't that happen? I mean, I'm assuming this is based in something. To give him the benefit of the doubt, conceivably, maybe he's talking about foreign intelligence services doing the spying. I mean, we do know, it has been reported that there was intelligence that our foreign allies shared with their U.S. counterparts once they encountered contacts between the Trump campaign and Russians. There's been pretty robust reporting that foreign intelligence agencies picked up on a number of occasions Trump associates on their intelligence intercepts in 2015 and 2016. The problem with that, as far as this spying on the Trump campaign theory goes, is that those foreign intelligence agencies weren't like, running a long-time surveillance operation on Michael Cohen or an X or Y Trump associate. As far as we can tell, the reason that all those Trump associates turned up on foreign intelligence intercepts is because those foreign intelligence agencies were watching the Russians. Like they do. That's what Western intelligence agencies do. And while they were watching the Russians, all these Trump associates and people close to the Trump campaign kept walking through the frame. Really? Another one? I mean, that's kind of part of the scary part. That's how we got the counterintelligence investigations in the first place. Information about Russians and about Russian behavior that weirdly intersected with all these people associated with one of the two presidential campaigns. So the Attorney General says they're spying on the Trump campaign. He tried to sort of walk it back a number of times in his testimony today. I'm not sure anybody knows what he means, but I'm sure it's playing well in the White House, and maybe that's the only thing he cares about. I want to say, though, there's one other part of the James Baker testimony, the FBI General Counsel testimony that we got today that I think is also worth paying attention to. And again, this is questioning of James Baker by congressional investigators. James Baker, they're questioning about him as his time as the FBI's top lawyer. Quote, question. You had said that the president's firing of FBI Director Comey you considered to be a threat to national security. And my question was, in what way was it a threat to national security? James Baker. So the investigation at a high level was about Russia, period, full stop. And it was trying to assess, in this particular instance, what the Russians were doing or had done with respect to the 2016 presidential election. We were trying to investigate what the Russians did and whether there were any Americans or others who had done things in support of those efforts, either knowingly or unknowingly, so that we could understand the full nature and scope of what the Russians had attempted to do. And so to the extent that this action of firing Director Comey may have been caused by or was the result of a decision to shut down that investigation, which I thought was a legitimate investigation, then that would frustrate our ability, to some degree, to ascertain what the Russians, as well as any other Americans or others, had done in furtherance of the objectives of the Russian Federation. So I guess the point is, not only would it be an issue about obstructing an investigation, but the obstruction itself would hurt our ability to figure out what the Russians had done. And that's what would be the threat to national security. Our inability, the inability or the delays, the difficulties we might have had with respect to trying to figure out what the Russians were doing, because our main objective was to thwart them, was to thwart the Russians. We are, of course, still waiting to see the Mueller report. It's nearly 3 weeks now. William Barr, the Attorney General, says he will hand it over. Yesterday he said it would be within a week. Today he said it would be sometime next week. Definitely sometime really soon. Somebody should ask him tomorrow and see when he's planning on releasing it tomorrow, because presumably it'll be a different answer. There remains this weird thing hanging out there about that report, which is that Bill Barr quotes Robert Mueller saying that Trump was not exonerated on the question of obstruction of justice. We've nevertheless got William Barr saying himself that he was deciding that the president was exonerated on obstruction of justice. And now we've got simultaneously and sort of coincidentally, now we've got 2 days of revelations from the FBI's former top lawyer talking about how serious the obstruction worries really were and how freaked out the top national security officials in the country were specifically about the obstruction problem. I mean, we've got no explanation from William Barr about how he looked at all that, scanned the 400 pages of Mueller's report, and immediately concluded, oh, definitely nothing here, and I don't want to talk about it. Nothing. Just believe me, I'm the bottom line. It's fine. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to tell you what Mueller found. I know Mueller says he's not exonerated, but I says he is. He is, I say. And I won't tell you how I arrived at that conclusion. That's just me talking. I mean, that is still where we are today. And the Attorney General is still not answering questions about it still. But somebody did try to pin him to the mat on it today, and I think burst a few veins in frustration in the process. Did you actually see what happened when Attorney General William Barr finally got pressed repeatedly on that today by somebody who would not take no for an answer? We've got that for you next, and the senator who did it as well. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.